Okay, welcome everyone. We have a bunch of folks on the call and we are streaming live on YouTube. And we're going to talk about going from zero to Tugboat. Tugboat, if you haven't seen our previous video, which gave an overview, I'd encourage you to check it out. Tugboat is a service that allows you to have full environments for every pull request, every branch, however many you want to spin up, for any type of web project. We make heavy use of it here at Chromatic, as I mentioned, for creating a full environment for each pull request that we create so we can see those changes live in the browser. Thanks for joining us. If you're watching, please subscribe to the channel if you want to get notified about future live streams and future videos, and we appreciate that. So jumping right in, I'm gonna take you through setting up a Tugboat configuration file and seeing on a site that has some level of complexity to it. It's got a database as well as a web server. How to get that live in Tugboat and loading in the browser. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And just to show everyone what we're starting with, we're going to be looking at the Chromatic site, chromatichq.com. We picked this site, as I mentioned, specifically because it's not just a static site. It has a database. It has other services. So our goal is going to be to get this live in a Tugboat environment. So when you log in with Tugboat, I authenticate with my GitHub credentials because that is where we host our code. When I do that, it's also going to automatically, since I've already authenticated and given access, it's going to have the ability to see our repos, and that's how we're going to add it. If you log in using your email address, you'll likely have to do a second step to do that. But I'm going to log in with GitHub here because I've logged in before. It's already authenticated. We're going to go into our Chromatic project. And here we're going to add a new repository today. I'll select the Chromatic organization and our zero to Tugboat repository. And we'll hit add repository. Okay, so now our repository has been added to Tugboat. We see that there is an open pull request, but we'll come back to that later. We don't need to worry about that right now. It hasn't done anything with it. And we're, well, I think the best place to look is we can start looking at the Tugboat configuration. So this is the Tugboat configuration we're going to look at first. This is the Tugboat config.yaml file. It is a YAML file. And this is where we're going to define to Tugboat what services we want to use, what we want Tugboat to do with them, and how we might want them to interact with each other. And we are also going to here define what steps we want Tugboat to take each time we build a preview in Tugboat. So I'm going to go ahead and start this building in Tugboat, and then while it's building, I'll come back and explain what's going on here. So here we're going to start with the Apache only branch. We'll say build preview, and we can click into that preview and we can see that one service is defined and it's building, and we can see logs down here. But while that's building, we'll switch back to the configuration file and we'll call out a couple things. So we saw that on the Tugboat page, Apache PHP is the one service we have configured, and we can see that that is because we've defined it here on line 3 of our configuration file. Line 4, though, is more important, not just what we're going to call it, but what is this service going to be. So here we're specifying a Docker image, and this is one of the Docker images that Tugboat publishes and provides. So it's the PHP image, and we're passing it the 7.4 Apache tags. The Tugboat documentation has a whole list of all kinds of different services that they publish themselves, and you can click through to see all of the different supported tags that are available to you. But for these purposes, this image is going to have PHP, it's going to have PHP 7.4, and it's going to have Apache. So there's different combinations of things you have access to, but you're not limited to what Tugboat publishes. These are just really helpful and useful, but you can point it at any public Docker image. And there are some reasons to do that we will likely cover in a future video. So it looked like our preview is finishing up building. So really quickly, and we'll come back to some of these concepts, but line 10, we define this as the default service. This is not going to do much right now because there's only one service that we've defined, but this command section is quite important. And these are all the commands that, and the steps within the command that Tugboat is going to run when it's building a preview. So here we see two commands, init and build. And we'll get a little bit more into the differences between those, but the important things to note are that they run in this order, init and then build. So here we're just enabling mod rewrite for Apache. We're restarting Apache. We're updating where we're creating a symlink so that to where Apache is already looking. We could instead, we could modify the Apache configuration file, but to point to a different place, but this I've found simpler. And then we're running composer install for our project. So we're installing our dependencies. So if we switch back to Tugboat, we see that this preview is ready, and I'm going to click preview and we're going to see an error. So we have a preview. We can see that PHP is parsing, Apache is serving, which is a win. And if we go to install.php, we should be able to see that, again, PHP is parsing, Drupal is installed, but we get an error, we get this page because there's no database yet. So the next step is we need to get the rest of the pieces of our site so that we can see the full live preview. So I'm going to go ahead and start a preview building and then talk about the configuration that it's building. So we'll go ahead and build the main branch. So this is the configuration that is building currently for the main branch. So there's a lot more in here. So top part is the same Apache PHP 7.4 image. But we have, if we scroll down to the bottom, we have a second image, and that's the MariaDB image here on line 62 and 63. So we have full access to run commands in that image. We can do all the same, similar steps if we had different operations that we needed or wanted to run, but we're not doing any of that here. We're running everything in our default images, in our default image, which is the Apache PHP image. It's typically what you're going to start with. Here on line 13, we've marked the Apache image as depending on the MariaDB image. So this Apache image can't build until the MariaDB image has been built because we are going to need access to what's there. So running through what's different about this image, or excuse me, what's different about our steps here. in this configuration file. We're installing a number of dependencies that we did not install before. We're installing some dependencies related to WebP. We're installing the AWS CLI, which I'll come back to in a minute. Here we are enabling those WebP PHP extensions. We're installing Node.js, and we're installing Node.js here because the Chromatic HQ theme depends on being built, and it depends on Yarn, so we install that next. The reason why we use Yarn here is quite relevant to Tugboat, is that we want the build to go as quickly as possible, and installing those dependencies and building the theme with Yarn in our testing gave us a large speed increase, which we were excited to make use of in Tugboat environments, in our production environments. We do some additional PHP configuration. You can change anything in your PHP configuration file in similar ways. So we update max file size, post max size, memory limit, but there's nothing special about those numbers. That's just what we're using here on the site. Again, similar to the other configuration, we are enabling mod rewrite and then restarting Apache. We're updating the symlink. That's all the same. So next up is something that trips a lot of folks up when they're getting started with Tugboat. And this is the way that we have chosen to do it, but there are many ways to do it. And the thing that trips a lot of folks up is getting the database into an environment. So you've got your code base, you know how you deploy it in production. Hopefully, maybe you're already scripting that in an automated way, so you know the steps that need to occur there. But how do you get that database? We take database dumps nightly, and we put them on S3. So we have chosen to use the AWS CLI here, which is why we install it up here on line 20, and we're going to set some environment variables so that we can pull the latest database dump directly from the AWS CLI. So to make that happen, I'm going to go back to the, and this failed because I hadn't done this step yet. So if we go back to the repository configuration, we go to repository settings, we can see sort of the general overview of what Tugboat allows us to configure. Most of these are all fine for for a default. We'll turn on posting preview links and pull request comments. And I think that's fine for now. Save the configuration. But the environment variables is the next important bit. So we need to set some environment variables with our credentials so that we can access our database dump in AWS. You can do that through this interface. I have them on my clipboard, and I'm going to stop sharing for a moment so I can paste those in. Okay, let's share my screen again. So now we will rebuild the main branch. And while that's building, we'll go back and continue looking at the configuration file. So we've installed the AWS CLI, and we're going to place those values in an AWS credentials file that the AWS CLI looks for. So these are the names of the environment variables that we've defined in the Tugboat settings page. So we set those here in lines 51 and 52. And so this is a good time, since we've made it through the entire init section, to call out the differences between these commands. So as I mentioned before, init runs first. And in our Apache only configuration, we had init and then build. Here we have an additional command, and that's update. So init is going to run first, update will run second, and build will run third. These are the three most common Tugboat commands, though there are others available for specific use cases. But these are the ones that you're probably going to use in every single Tugboat configuration file you create. And the order, it's not just the order that's important, but why are they broken up in this way? If it was only the order, we could just run everything in init. So, so when you create a preview, like we are doing here, we did with the Apache only branch, and like we're doing with the main branch, it starts with the init step. But one of the great features of Tugboat is that once you have a preview built, you can mark it as a base preview. And when we mark something as a base preview, this is not the one we will actually want to use, but we'll unmark it when we're done. When we mark it as the base preview, it goes to this different section down here. And when you build pull requests in the future, they will utilize this base preview, and they won't run the full set of commands. So if we go back to our configuration, you'll see the update command and the build command. So when you have a base preview and a pull request preview is built with it, only the build step is going to run. So the init step is going to be everything that we need to do only once to configure the box. Update is where we pull in our data. And the reason why we separate this out, this is not something that we want to run every time that we create a pull request, but it's also not something that we only want to run once. With the update command, we can configure Tugboat to refresh the base preview. You can configure it to refresh once a week, once a day. We typically set ours to refresh nightly. So what that means is that all of these steps in init only run the first time the service is built. For us, depending on how you configure it, for us, update will run every night, and build will run every time you create a preview. So every time you create a preview, and every time you, let's say it's when you create a pull request, and every time you push new changes to that pull request. So these are the steps essentially in the build command that you would run to deploy to production also. So you're mimicking your production deployment, hopefully there. So within the update step, I mentioned that this is where we pull in our database, and we're using the Robo Task Runner to abstract some of that. But the basic steps that we're running here, we're using the AWS CLI to get a listing of the database dumps in our bucket. We are determining what is the most recent one, downloading it, and then importing it into MySQL, just using the MySQL command line. So it's just a few steps. You could do something similar with SCP if you're, if you have your database dumps on a server, not on AWS or something similar. But essentially, wherever your database is that you're going to gain access to it, you need to determine what you want to download it, and then import it into MySQL. So that's what's happening here in the update step. And then it moves on to the build step. Let's just check on our preview, still building. We're getting there. We're in the build step now. So in the build step, we're running composer install to install our dependencies. We're building our theme. We're clearing the drush cache, and then we're running drush deploy. And drush deploy, if you're not familiar with it, is a relatively new drush command that packages up updb, configuration import,
cache clear.
Cache clear, thank you, Adam. And all into one command in a consistent order every time. One thing I forgot to mention is why we are running composer install in the update step as well. So the reason why we need to do this is that Robo, our task runner, is one of our dependencies. So we need to make sure that that is installed and or up to date before we run the Robo command that we have created. But we also want it on line 58 because, again, this update command is not going to run every time we create a preview. So we need to run it in both places. Ideally, this second one, if they are running subsequently, like they're going to on our branch that we're building, it's going to run very fast because all the dependencies are already installed and already up to date. So if let's go back and check on our build. So we have good news. We're in the final stage and it's committing it. Another nice feature of Tugboat is the concept, since it is built on Docker, when it's done, it will commit the build. And the reason that is sometimes useful to you is you can go into your preview, make changes, add content, maybe test something, maybe break something. And if you want to, you can do what Tugboat terms a reset and reset the Tugboat preview back to the state that it was when it was last committed, so when it was built. So you could go in, make changes, then reset the preview. It'll go back to the last known committed state. So while it is in the last step here, let's just go back and let's unset this branch from being a base preview. And we see that it now goes back into this general point here. Now live demos, let's cross our fingers and hope that when I click preview here, we're going to see the live site. Looking pretty good. We've got images, we have the database, obviously. That's another thing that's important to note. We didn't bring in any of the files directory. You could, in the same way that you bring in the database, you could bring in a files directory, or, if this is, we're talking about a Drupal site here, but if you have files that are not tracked by version control, user-generated files, you could bring them in. We're using a module for Drupal called Stage File Proxy for our non-production environments that allows us to pull those files on demand from production if they're not present in our development environment or in our Tugboat environment. So we're skipping that. So now we have a preview built of our main branch, and we'll go ahead and set that as our base preview. So that gave an overview of how to get Tugboat set up and built, but really the great value add of Tugboat is those base previews. So what I'd like to show next is the building of a pull request preview that's based on the base preview. So if we go to
Mark, can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
I feel like you're kind of burying the lead. Can you just go to the root of the repo and just show that, the beauty of all this is that all of that configuration for your server for the Tugboat environment is all just in a .config file. So there's nothing other, you've shown everything that needs to happen.
That's it. That's the tweet.
Yeah. Tugboat does everything from that, builds up the server, does it automatically on every push, all those things. I kind of just don't want to gloss over that, which is it's as simple as going from 0 to Tugboat is as simple as having a .config file in your repository. Yes. And having
everything that I went through in this one file. Thank you, Chris. It should be noted that that's it. And there's nothing else necessary beyond what you configure in the UI and the dashboard and this configuration file, and that's it. So if we go to our pull request, I created a pull request ahead of time, and it has a one-line change where we add an additional H1 into our header. So if we go back to the Tugboat dashboard, what I should do is I should create this. Let's go ahead and make this change again. because what I want to show is that Tugboat does all this automatically. So here we have this file on the main branch. Let's go ahead and edit it. We will create a new pull request. Okay, so I've created the pull request in GitHub with my one line change. And if we go back to the dashboard, we'll see that the pull request number 7, which is the pull request that I just created, is now building. And the key piece here is this from main. You can see that on this, the Apache only branch that we built first does not have that. So what's happening in this pull request preview is that it's building the changes in the pull request and it's basing it on this main base preview. So it is only running the build steps right here. So if we go back and we click into it and look at the logs, we're building our theme right now. While that's building, I should note that, so Tugboat gives you access to building all of the different references that are available in your Git repo. There's also options in the UI to sort of easily get at alternate approaches. So as I mentioned, this is being built with a base preview. Maybe you don't want that for some reason on a specific branch. You can do that through the UI. Tugboat also has a great command line tool that gives you access to all that and a lot more to be able to control that from the command line, check the status of previews, create new previews, get statistics on previews, rename them. And there's also a lot of great data down at the bottom as your previews are built and rebuilt and refreshed over time around the size that they take up and the build lengths. So as this is going through, okay, we're in the final stage here for committing. But one thing that we'll note is that this main branch took 6 minutes to build, and it's taking up 2.93 gigabytes of space. And if we click into it, we can see we've got about 1 gigabyte for the database, about just less than 2 gigabytes for Apache, PHP, and all those any files that are on that disk and that container. And if we notice here on the preview that we just built from the pull request, it was built in about 2 minutes. And it's only taking up 341 megabytes. So that's because it is based on the base preview. So if we click the preview button and get to see the site live in the browser, we can see here's our lovely H1, and it's doing exactly what we want it to do. If I created this pull request and I asked Chris to approve it, he might go into the diff in GitHub and say, okay, we're adding a H1, that seems reasonable. I don't have a lot of other context, but sure, approved. But because we have Tugboat, we can go and we can see here in the comments, we configured Tugboat to add a comment with the link. And so when he opens that up as a reviewer of the pull request, he can see that change live in the browser. He doesn't have to check that branch out. He doesn't have to pull the latest database. He doesn't have to build the theme locally. That's all been done for him, and he can be a much more effective reviewer and see those changes live in the browser before he gives feedback or approves. In this case, he'd probably be giving feedback and saying something's not right. Give it another shot.
Mark, in that instance, that example you just gave where somebody is asked to do some review and then, Tugboat does its magic, creates an entire QA environment for said reviewer or set of reviewers to review those changes and say they're approved. Can you just, what happens after on the Tugboat or on the GitHub side of things? Chris has approved, Mark merges, branch is closed. What then happens on the Tugboat side?
So once a pull request is closed, whether it be merged or not, let's see, it should delete the Tugboat environment, which it did. And so you're only, depending on how you configure, you could manage all this yourself. Even if you are not using GitHub, if you don't want that type of tight integration, you could build your branches on demand. You could build them, you could script something with the CLI, like that. All of that's available to you. But sort of our base use case is typically we want an open preview for every pull request. There's also some, nice functionality around keeping some state. So we typically think about Tugboat as this transient environment where, as Chris just highlighted and we showed, where pull request is open, you review the changes, maybe you add some test content, and then it's gone. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. You can build previews and keep them around for as long as you need to. You can also lock previews. So locking a preview would prevent someone from resetting it or it refreshing automatically with a new database if you have Tugboat configured to do that. So maybe you want an environment that you want people to be able to stage test content in. You could build an environment from a pull request or from a branch. You could lock it, and then until you explicitly unlock it and take some other action, delete it, refresh it, rebuild it, whatever it is, that's going to be a stable environment that can stay around, and content can be added, tested, etc. So we love Tugboat because Tugboat is flexible in that way that we have a way that we use it most of the time, but it's flexible enough that it can support these other use cases as well. I'm just looking at my notes to see if there was anything that I missed that I wanted to cover. Does anybody have any questions? Anything I missed that I should highlight?
What are the takeaways, Mark?
All right. Takeaways are that Tugboat is fast. Tugboat is simple to configure, but it's very flexible. So I think that the YAML file can be intimidating to some folks, but it's, just keep in mind that all it is essentially a checklist. It's a list of things that that are going to need to happen on on your server, on your environment when it's created. And if you can do it manually, you could do it in the Tugboat file. So it's just a question of stepping through those pieces and getting it set up to where you need it to be set up. And yeah. Anything else? Any other questions? Thanks everyone for being a good audience. Mm-hmm. Please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and we will be here and see you for the next one.
Thanks, Mark.
Everybody.